Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today, tonight, this evening for our webinar about the urban aspects of the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework and the latest discussions that have happened about that. I am Mika Tan, and I will be presenting for this webinar tonight, along with my co-host, Jennifer, who will be helping with the technical aspects and just making sure that everyone's questions are taken into account and that we can answer them in time throughout the webinar. We'll first then start out really quickly with an outline of what we will cover this webinar. First, of course, to introduce to everyone what this Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework is. And the zero draft for it. The zero draft is essentially just a basis for discussions, and I will highlight the urban aspects that are in this draft, as well as the discussions that have happened at what we call the OEWG2. That's an acronym that you will learn about later today. Then what next? Where do we go from zero? Upcoming meetings to solidify this post-2020 framework will be covered, and also other related initiatives on urban biodiversity and the post-2020 framework. And finally, hopefully after about 45 minutes, I'll open up the time for question and answer. And without further ado, let's go to talk about who I am. Most of you might know me.
I am currently based in the Philippines. I am from Singapore. My name is Mika. If my internet starts getting really choppy, I might have to cut the live video, but here you can see my face. I wear many hats, and what that means is I have many roles. My paid role during the day is being the coordinator of a youth biodiversity program for ASEAN, which is the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. So I'm very proud to be representing my region also at these meetings. And at the same time, I'm also helping to coordinate the Southeast Asia chapter of the Global Youth Biodiversity Network. So ASEAN is intergovernmental, whereas Global Youth Biodiversity Network, or GYBN, is a constituency of the CBD. So we're not governmental. But most of you here would know me as also part of the Urban Biodiversity Hub, which I've been able to work on together with Jennifer, my co-host here, Jennifer Pierce. Could you just say hi?
Yeah. Sure. My name is Jennifer Ray Pierce. I'm joining you from Vancouver in Canada. And I'm also one of the co-founders. And we also have at least one other member of our steering committee here as well. So there's a few of us here representing Urban Biodiversity Hub. So thanks everyone for joining.
Yeah, and Urban Biodiversity Hub, if you cannot tell from Jennifer's introduction, we're actually located globally. And we're an all volunteer run organization that I'll explain a little bit more, but we focus really on being a hub for urban biodiversity resources for cities. And jumping in with the first, I'm also referencing my notes as we go along, so pardon me if I'm trying to get into different pages. But not everyone here knows fully what the Convention on Biological Diversity is, so I just thought I would quickly just give a one-liner. If you know about the Convention on Climate Change, or if you have heard about the Paris Agreement and global agreements about climate change, this is the sister. It is the Global Agreement on Biological Diversity, which we're interested in. And the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework is essentially an agreement for the next decades that will define global action to address biodiversity loss. And why we say for the next decades is that it's post-2020. It's not just for the decade of 2021 to 2030, but rather it's a framework that wants to look beyond the decadal strategic plans. And it's post-2020 because we are currently in a strategic plan for the decade 2011 to 2020. So this would be a follow-up to that strategic plan under the Convention on Biological Diversity. And the convention is signed by nearly all the countries in the world, except for the Vatican and the United States. We can talk at length about why they're not signatories or what we call parties to the convention, but that's another discussion to be had. But what this means is that most of the world is signed on and bound to this convention on biological diversity. And the governments that sign the convention, we call them parties. They have voting rights. And they decide on things by having meetings called the Conference of the Parties, or COP. The next one is the 15th COP, which would be happening. It was supposed to happen in 2020, in October, but things have been shifted, as we all know. So we will, I'll talk about when the timeline would be like for this. But the ambition of this global biodiversity framework is that it should be a framework for all, not just for signatories of the ministries of environment, but really it's for whole of government approach, a whole of society approach, or that's the ambition of this framework. It's supposed to be guiding all the other conventions and multilateral agreements for the biological diversity aspect. So it's a really big deal. I guess that's what you can take from this one slide. It's a big deal. But that's on the international stage. And how does this relate to local action? How do they talk to each other? So that's what we'll dive into in a bit. The zero draft is the jargon that we use to talk about the current version that we have of this framework. As you can imagine, a global framework of this scale and of this ambition would be massive. It would be difficult to come to a draft easily. So the Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity, as well as the co-chairs of the working group that's tasked to come up with this framework, has worked on a zero draft. So this is pre-first draft. And what it looks like is it's a UN document. So it may be very new to people who are not used to reading international policy documents. And it can be intimidating because there's a lot of jargon that's being used. But I will break it down in just understandable chunks. So this zero draft currently is essentially the basis of discussions. We need to start somewhere. They spent all of 2019 compiling, having consultations and a series of regional and thematic meetings all over the world to get input from all the stakeholders about what this framework should look like, how should it be structured, what kind of ambition do we want. And it's also a compilation of submissions that were sent to the CBD Secretariat via online means. So if people were not able to attend these meetings, they were able to also submit their thoughts via the CBD Secretariat online. So this zero draft is not a plain compilation of all of that. It is rather a synthesis and the basis to start discussions about actual text for the Post-2020 framework. And these discussions, the zero draft was released in January 2019 in all the 6 UN languages. And the first instance where the parties and other stakeholders could meet to discuss it was in the second session of the open-ended working group on the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, or we can call it OEWG. So OEWG 2 happened in the last week of February in Rome, in Italy. And we also know that a lot has happened since then. Thankfully, many of us have returned from this meeting safe and sound, and we're tiding through the situation. The third session is postponed. It was originally scheduled for the end of July this year in Colombia, but it has been postponed understandably. So the structure of this document is that you have first a background, as you can see in the screenshot. The background discusses sort of why this framework came about and how it was produced. Then there's an introduction to the zero draft. Then there's a draft recommendation for the open-ended working group. So the actual text itself doesn't have the content of the framework. It's actually in the annex. So Annex 1 of this document is that zero draft, the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Then Annex 2 is some other technical document that the policymakers use. So we're now going to jump in to analyze this Annex 1. Let me just make sure that I have covered all the points. So Annex 1 is structured generally into two big chunks. There's an introduction to the Global Biodiversity Framework, and then the framework itself. In the introduction, you have the background, the purpose, and a discussion about the theory of change that they have with this framework. And the framework itself comprises these sections, A all the way through H. And it's important to at least understand that they're structured with the letters because they are referenced very often in the documents later on, like section A or section E to F, for example. So sections A to C are, if we could put a broad brush, it is the broad picture that we're trying to get to in 2030. So the framework has taken a stepwise kind of structure where they're working towards 2030, but with the 2050 vision in mind. So sections A, B, and C are the broad picture. Section D is the 2030 action targets. So there they enumerate 20 targets, which the number 20 is the same as the number of targets that we have in this current strategic plan 2011 to 2020. And the targets are called the Aichi targets. So if you've heard of these terms before, the Aichi targets are what we have currently, and they're set to expire in 2020. So this zero draft has taken on the same number of 20 targets. Then sections E to H are what we would think of as sort of the supporting ecosystem that would allow us to be able to deliver on the targets and towards that big picture. So this is how I've come to understand it, but what you might see if you actually have a copy of the zero draft, which is publicly available, I can show you where to get it if you'd like. That sort of the green pyramid that I have, not pyramid, the green ladder that I have on the left is translated into this theory of change diagram in the Post-2020 framework. So you can see here that the 2050 vision on the right, that big block of black, that's living in harmony with nature. That's the vision that we all want to work towards. And to get there, we have some interim goals from 2030 to 2050, which are, there are 5 main ones, and they revolve around conservation of species, around sustainable use of biodiversity, and about equitable sharing of the benefits that arise from the use of biodiversity, the sustainable use of biodiversity. So these 3 are the pillars of the Convention on Biological Diversity, the 3 pillars. And why is that so? We would want to have healthy, resilient ecosystems and want to ensure that human needs are met towards that vision of living in harmony with nature. So the action targets are actually then in the leftmost big box. You'll see there tools and solutions, reducing threats, meeting people's needs in 3 blocks. Those are actually the action targets, which I will explain in greater detail. And that's how these action targets lead to the goals. And supporting the action targets, you have sections E, F, G, and H, which are the means of implementation, the enabling conditions, responsibility and transparency, and the last one about outreach and awareness. And all of that is encompassed within a 2030 mission. This is how the Zero draft has structured it into a theory of change, but there's a lot of room for discussion about whether this makes sense and how we can improve on it. But that's not the main point of discussion here. So I'll go right into that into the different portions of the framework and what urban aspects there are. So the 2050 vision, it's living in harmony with nature, where by 2050, biodiversity is valued, conserved, restored, and widely used, maintaining ecosystem services, sustaining a healthy planet, and delivering benefits essential for all people. The next part, which is the goals, the 2030 and 2050 goals, that's section B of the document, of the annex, highlights 5 goals. And these are structured as A, B, C, D, E. And I've colored here the main points or the main topics. The first one is about ecosystems. The second one's about species. And the third's about genetic diversity. So you can see it kind of reflects the complexity of biodiversity from genetics, species, and ecosystem scale. So A, B, and C cluster around the first pillar of the convention, which is about conservation of biodiversity. And the second pillar is about sustainable use, that's benefits to people. So that's the blue one. And under goal D, there's actually some benefits that are highlighted, which include about nutrition, about clean water provision, resilience to natural disasters, and how this can complement the Paris Agreement or contribute to. Oh, oops, sorry. And then the last one, which is which reflects the third pillar of the convention, is about the fair and equitable sharing of benefits that arise from the sustainable use of biodiversity, including its genetic resources and associated traditional knowledge. Let me know or let Jennifer know if I'm going too fast in terms of my speech, because I know that not everyone here has English as their first language. And the 2030 mission, section C, is to take, so this is what the Zero draft says that the world should do by 2030 so that we can achieve our 2050 vision. To take urgent action across society to put biodiversity on a path to recovery for the benefit of planet and people. And this is the meat of what the framework can. So the first 3 sections, A, B, and C, like I said, are the broad picture. There was discussion at the latest working group about whether that structure reflects how we would want to move forward. But I will not get into that discussion right in this meeting. I will instead focus a little bit more about the action targets, the 20 action targets, and what urban aspects are in there. So as I mentioned before, the 2030 action targets lie here in that theory of change. It is split into 3 main sections for reducing threats to biodiversity, and B, meeting people's needs through sustainable use and benefit sharing, and tools and solutions for implementing the framework and mainstreaming of biodiversity to other sectors or to development. And you can see that there is the number of targets per section is not equal. And in the first section, you have targets 1 to 6. And I am paraphrasing here. So these targets are not the exact ones that are in the draft. I'm paraphrasing so that it can fit into one slide, because not most of the time policy documents don't fit very well on PowerPoint presentations. But generally, it's about the direct drivers of biodiversity loss and how we can measure if we're doing well on it or not. For example, the area of protected areas, connectivity, integrity of ecosystems, invasive alien species and their control, reducing pollution, ensuring that there's sustainable harvesting, trade, and use of wild species. And the last one, to contribute to climate change mitigation and adaptation. In this section, there's not too much about urban aspects, and the discussions didn't really go into that either. But in the next section, under meeting people's needs, this is targets 7 to 11. There are a couple of targets that are relevant here. Well, not a couple, a few. So the first one is about enhancing the sustainable use of wild species, providing benefits to all, and reducing human-wildlife conflict. So so as I mentioned, in order for it to fit on a slide, I just took the essence of it, and this is the full target 7. And if you see here, there are square brackets. For example, here, food security and livelihoods for at least square bracket X million people. And the square bracket in the discussions here just mean that it's not fixed text. It's just, for now, a placeholder. The text in there might change. But reading it out loud for those that might not be able to see the slides, it reads, enhance the sustainable use of wild species, providing, by 2030, benefits, including enhanced nutrition, food security and livelihoods for at least X million people, especially for the most vulnerable, and reduce human-wildlife conflict by X%. So the piece here that's particularly interesting and relevant for us urbanites is about the human-wildlife conflict, that increasingly there are more and more instances of human-wildlife interaction within cities, partly because of expansion of cities, and partly because wild habitats for these wildlife are being degraded elsewhere, and they're venturing closer and closer to cities. So that's been documented very well in the Nature in the Urban Century Assessment report that was released last year. So I would encourage everyone to take a look at that. But I'm sure that many of you here who are actually practitioners and working in the municipalities, you might have come into issues of human-wildlife interaction in the cities and how to deal with that. So during the discussions at the OEWG, there was a little point about changing it and reflecting more of this as human-wildlife interaction, not just conflict, and hence to manage the interaction, not to reduce the interaction, because the interactions can be positive, it can also be neutral, it can be conflict, which we all understand. So this rewording was generally supported. The next target that's relevant for our discussion is about enhancing nature-based solutions, contributing by 2030 to clean water provision for at least XXX million people. And the reason that I'm not jumping into discussions about the numbers is because a lot of that also didn't make sense personally to me, that it would only be accessible for certain millions of people when there are billions of people in this world, and the fact that clean water should be a human right. But that's a discussion for another time. And it was also acknowledged that the numbers are going to be discussed at a later stage. This current stage of discussions is about the zero draft in its current form. So the key thing here is about nature-based solutions. And I'm sure actually many of us here have come across that term, or if not, this term is also something that needs to be clarified further for a lot of the parties or a lot of the countries. The discussions were about the use of the term nature-based solutions or ecosystem-based approaches. And there was some contention here because the idea of nature-based solutions came from generally the climate change realm. And it is also new to some of the negotiators for the CBD. So they're not clear on what exactly constitutes a nature-based solution. Some are very obvious, but some might be sort of, where is that boundary? There were questions like that. Whereas the term ecosystem-based approaches has been used before within the realm of the CBD and is familiar to many of the policymakers there. And I'm actually referencing some of my notes just so that I am sure I won't be missing out on some things. It's also the term nature-based solutions, because of its use primarily for climate change or, for example, for carbon storage, has raised some concerns for some people at the meeting that it could be used for anything that stores carbon and is not necessarily based on an ecosystem-based approach, that it's not necessarily increasing biodiversity, but that would solve some kind of human problem. So this was a discussion point, and we have not reached any resolution about it. But there are strong supporters of nature-based solutions, and there are also views of not using this term and going to ecosystem-based approaches. And the second point here was generally, was that clean water should not be the only target in here, and it's also misleading that clean water is what we should be working towards. Rather, it should be biodiversity as a whole, or to not exclude other ecosystem services that biodiversity provides.
Mika?
Yes.
You're doing great on time, just so you know. We did have a comment from Adrian, who has joined us on the previous slide that I thought was worth sharing.
Okay.
Let's see, Adrian, do you want to share that, or would you like me to paraphrase? You can unmute yourself. About the nature-based solution versus ecosystem-based approaches.
Okay, so my background is actually originally from the climate world. The term nature-based solutions versus ecosystem-based approaches are two sides of the same coin, but they're not opposite, so they work hand in hand. So a nature-based solution, for example, I'm a beekeeper. So my particular solution actually is both a nature-based solution, and it can be an ecosystem-based approach. The challenge is it doesn't automatically make my beekeeping business an ecosystem-based approach because, for example, I could be abusing my bees. I could be treating them with pesticides. And of course, a lot of that pesticide that I'm using to treat for, like, for example, small hive beetle, could be absorbed in the wax, which could go on to being absorbed in the makeups that my wax is used in. So yes, it could be a nature-based solution on one side, but am I using ecosystem-based approaches? So, for example, I'm an urban organic beekeeper, which is an oxymoron because I can't be certified as organic in the urban context, but I'm using nature-based, I'm not using any pesticides, so technically it's organic, except for that I'm existing in the urban context. So, For example, if I'm using my wax to make makeup for women, then it's still an ecosystem-based approach, because then I am also trying to replant trees in an urban context. So I'm restoring the urban forestry, right? So making sure that I'm including genetic diversity, species diversity, and ecosystem diversity in an urban context. So the two terms are not the same based on what Miko said that they were arguing about, right? I could see the confusion, but the two in the climate context are two different things. Yes, we have a tendency to use it as carbon stores, and so that particular concern is valid. But they're using it, it might be used as an excuse not to use a term. When they're two different things, but they have to work hand in hand, and that's my input.
Yeah, thanks, Adrian. That's a really great real life example of why this confuses people. It confuses people because you might be doing that, but then in different ways, and it's called a nature-based solution, or it's called an ecosystem-based approach, and that's exactly why there was a lot of discussion about this term, whether we should have both, whether we should only have one of them. And there was a general consensus in the discussions that we should have a glossary of what these things are, and so we can understand them better, and ensure that if we say nature-based solutions, that they should also not harm biodiversity, for example. Yeah. Thank you, Adrian, for the input. And again, if anyone else also has questions or ideas related to what we're talking about, please raise it. And thanks, Jennifer, for bringing that up. Okay, so the next target should be, at least to me, the most interesting and relevant one for urbanites and the realm of urban biodiversity. It is essentially a target about biodiversity in urban spaces, or especially for urban dwellers, as is worded. So it reads, this is target 10. It reads, enhance the benefits of green spaces for health and well-being, especially for urban dwellers, increasing by 2030 the proportion of people with access to such spaces by at least bracket 100%. So we're not discussing the percentage, the numbers here, but generally speaking, parties or countries, signatories to the convention, they like this target, and they actually want it to be stronger. They want it to be clearer so that it doesn't backtrack, because there was a comment that said, well, you can think of it as increasing the amount of green spaces for urban dwellers to be able to be in close proximity to, but you can also think of it as increasing urban space such that they are, and diminishing green spaces so that more people would be closer to green spaces. So there was discussion about how to word it so that it would not be misleading, that there was general consensus that we do not want to backtrack on the amount of existing green spaces. And in fact, we want to improve it by including terms like the quality, the extent of the spaces, the connectivity of the spaces. This is a lot of what we talk about in urban biodiversity. The spatial distribution of where these spaces are in reference to the geology of the city or urban dwelling, or also in relation to social pockets. There was discussion about having equal access, not just access to such green spaces. And there was also mention, which heartened me a lot, about this being the intention of this to create that connection to nature, to bring especially urban dwellers closer to nature. Then there was also discussion about blue spaces. It's not just green per se. And then how it's not just for health and well-being, that it's also for climate resilience. And then a way to measure this quantitatively is to have, for example, a percent of the population within a certain, not radius, but within a certain time frame of being able to get to a green space. So not necessarily as the bird flies, but say 400 meters, you're 400 meters away from a green space, which would take about 10 minutes walk, is what was said. So that constitutes as a healthy distance away for exposure and connection to nature. And this is actually a reference to a new indicator that will be coming up in the revised Singapore Index on Cities Biodiversity. I am not going to discuss that here right now, but for many of you, you might know about it. And if you don't, we can also send some resources your way. It's a really cool index to see how far along a city is in their biodiversity efforts. And lastly, there was some discussion which was also really interesting to explore the urban-rural linkages. So although this target is especially meant for urban dwellers, the parties did not forget that urban spaces don't exist in isolation. There are many linkages between its hinterland and that they would like to see some form of that being reflected. That this is also about urban-rural linkages and spatial planning. So generally speaking, this was a great success for us that care about urbanization and biodiversity. So moving on to the last section of the action targets, we have tools and solutions. This is the largest in terms of the number of targets. It's targets 12 to 20. And I'm not going to go into every single target, but focus on some which touch more on ecological footprints and sustainable consumption lifestyles. So that would be 14 and 17 for now. The rest are not able to fit on this slide. Target 14, whoops, let me just make sure that I am there, yeah. So target 14 is, I'll just read it out. It says, reform economic sectors towards sustainable practices, including along their national and transnational supply chains, achieving by 2030 a reduction of at least, bracket, 50% in negative impacts on biodiversity. So there were lots of discussion about this because it's not as concrete as some people would like, but it's also difficult to capture a lot of this into a target because we're trying to address now the indirect drivers of biodiversity loss, things like consumption patterns and supply chains, which are often not necessarily governed by the countries, but by the multinational corporations. But there are ways in which governments, which this document is intended for, that governments can take a lead on to address that. There was clarification on what it means for negative impacts on biodiversity and how do you quantify that and have a reduction in that. But those are generally what we see in a lot of the targets, where how do you quantify this and how do we know what the baseline is. But the concepts here that were emerging during the discussions include things like our footprints and the fact, and there was mentioned too, that ecological footprints can be a methodology, can be a quantitative way to try and start measuring this amorphous thing of, you know, national and transnational supply chains and what our impact is on biodiversity beyond our country borders. And I mean, even as we're thinking beyond our city borders, this one's at the national scale, beyond the country border. Other concepts that came about would be environmental reporting, mechanisms for companies, the idea of a circular economy. So not just thinking about supply chains like the production side of things, but also in the waste management side of things. So it was heartening to know that parties were not just taking things at face value. They actually really do care about what it takes to reform economic sectors. But it was also unclear how these targets, and I put both 14 and 17 here, because 17 talk about, as it reads, is people everywhere take measurable steps, towards sustainable consumption and lifestyles. So it's not, there are overlaps here and there between the supply chain and about consumption patterns. So there was discussion, if for me, it's difficult to split them, it's even more so for 190 something countries to come to a set of action targets. And the last set of targets in tools and solutions, I'm bringing back here target 17, because again, this section is a little bit more difficult to put into targets, distinct targets. So there was discussion about targets 17 and 20, also related to sustainable consumption, production, and lifestyles. So as they read, 17 again is people everywhere take measurable steps towards sustainable consumption and lifestyles. Target 20 then reads, foster diverse visions of good quality of life and unleash values of responsibility to effect by 2030 new social norms for sustainability. So already it's sort of difficult for me to understand what this means as a target. How do you measure it? How do you start going about it? But that's a discussion that people did have at the working group. And one point that I want to bring up was that there was a mention about biophilia in all of this discussion, where to combine targets 17 and 20, there was a suggestion that reads, by 2030, everyone should be aware that biodiversity is essential and crucial for human survival, health, and quality of life, and hence will be biophilic through intensification of public awareness efforts and incorporation of biodiversity into education curricula at all levels worldwide. So the suggestion is really taking an education and public awareness focus to build that love for nature. That's what biophilia, or living things, love for living things, biophilia. And therefore lead us to this transformational change that's required, where biodiversity is seen as essential for human survival. So these were some of the discussions. And I'd just like to cover now. So we've gone through the 20 targets here in section D. And then comes the so-called supporting ecosystem, sections E to H. And just so that, just to be clear, E to H would otherwise take up a substantive amount of discussion, because it's where the money comes in. And when people talk about money, they talk about it for a really long time. But at the open-ended working group discussion that we just had in February, it was recognized that there will be that a lot of the text in these current sections of E to H are placeholder text, as in more work needs to be done on that text, because more meetings were scheduled to be held to discuss these sections specifically. And so the parties understood, but they again reiterated the importance of these sections for the success of the framework. If there's no support for the implementation, that includes things like resources, capacity building, technological transfer, South-South cooperation, things like that, or enabling conditions, things like participation of the stakeholders, recognition of rights of indigenous peoples, having the framework be gender responsive, and include gender equality. synergies with other multilateral agreements, partnerships at different levels, all the way from the local up to the international. So that's where there was a relevant suggestion for thinking about national and subnational cooperation, which is that there was a suggestion for this particular section to include active involvement of subnational governments, cities, and local authorities, and the recognition of their subnational competence for the implementation of the framework. So that's relatively strong language for the role that subnational governments can play in this supposedly national level framework. And that brings me to sort of an overall summary of the discussions at OEWG2, which is here the second point about the role of subnational and local government. But overall, the parties wanted to increase the level of ambition of the post-2020 framework. Many parties felt that it was a good starting point, but we can work to make it better. And it has to really tackle what needs to get done in order for us to put biodiversity not just on a path to recovery, but to have biodiversity start recovering already. We don't have much time to reach the 2050 vision. And the role of subnational and local government was highlighted time and time again during the discussions, with many parties strongly supporting subnational and local government involvement in this framework. But there's still and then many other countries too that recognize that it's important to have a whole of government and at all levels effort. So whole of government, not just the environment sector, but also the all the other productive sectors, for example, and the social sectors, and that it should be at the national level and subnational levels according to the countries. But it still remains to be seen how exactly this framework can be scalable up and down these different levels of government. The Urban Biodiversity Hub had done some preliminary discussions and workshops about looking at indicators at the city level for biodiversity and how that matches up with international and national level indicators for biodiversity. And they don't necessarily map very well. So this still leaves a big part of the implementation of the framework for us to work out. And mainstreaming biodiversity was a key point. It was very critical in the discussions, and strengthening the linkages between biodiversity and also planning processes. So planning for the country, but also planning at the city level, and how that links with health and well-being. And as we know now, there's a lot of discussion about access to green spaces while we're being at home. And And to remind everyone again, the nature-based solutions discourse discussion is still not resolved, and we'll continue to have that discussion to come. And of course, the challenge of formulating indicators and reporting on them is always there, but we will work on it to come. And well, what's next? A lot of the meetings that are happening or that were to happen to solidify this framework such that it would have been adopted by October 2020 are now postponed as we can...
Mika?
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, before we move on to this section, Sabrina has raised her hand.
Uh-huh.
Hi, can you go back to the previous slide for just a second?
This one?
Yeah, I guess maybe just a note to add, and maybe it falls under planning processes in terms
Sorry,
of
what planning processes?
Yeah, so under mainstreaming biodiversity and strengthening linkages,
Mm-hmm.
I just wanted to point out, and it may fall under planning processes, but emergency management and response is often treated separately than planning and health and well-being at the local government level. And I think it's important to recognize that that needs to be in here as well.
Yeah, yeah. We at UpHub have also thought about it, especially in this time. But that's a great addition. I can't edit the slides right now, but we'll take note of that. Yeah. So what next? This is a long list of meetings that were supposed to happen, but essentially what I'm trying to say is that for the first bullet point is that a scientific and technical meeting was supposed to meet to discuss the numbers, the indicators, and the baselines. This is now being postponed to August, and we will continue to see if that might change. And back to back with it would be a meeting about implementation. So fleshing out how would you implement this along with other topics. So this broadly speaking, it's also being postponed to August, but we'll again see if that can happen. The next working group meeting, so the one that just happened in Italy was OEWG2, and the next one, OEWG3, has been postponed. I at least do not know right now if there are any specific dates for its postponement. And other than these meetings, there are many thematic consultations that were supposed to happen. They've either been pushed online or postponed, and other related global conferences that are not coordinated by the Secretariat of the CBD, but are related. So for example, the IUCN World Conservation Congress that was supposed to happen in June, which has now been postponed to January 2021, was also another opportunity or another platform for further discussions of a lot of people that work in the international biodiversity space. And of course, COP15, originally scheduled for October this year, would be moved to 2021, but we do not know yet if there's any thoughts of changing it from China. But for now, we know that it's still going to be held in Kunming, China, until sometime in 2021, but we don't know yet when. So other related global initiatives that are still moving ahead while this timeline has been postponed, shifted almost by about 6 months or so, are initiatives here, which I will very briefly talk about, and I know some of you here represent some of these initiatives. One of which is the Cities with Nature platform by ICLE. ICLE is essentially the the subnational and local government constituency to the CBD. And they have a really cool platform called the Cities with Nature platform, where cities can choose a pathway for a sustainability topic of their choice, such as biodiversity. And the pathway then aids the city to make choices and plans for that particular topic. And for what I know, there's a commitment platform that's under development. And because ICLE is so closely related with the CBD, that this commitment platform is structured so that cities can contribute to the Post-2020 framework. So that we'll have to discuss a lot about what that means in terms of the scalability, but that's one effort underway to try and tackle that really complex issue. And there's the IUCN Urban Alliance, which is creating the Urban Nature Index, which is the first index of its kind that integrates urban and nature across different scales. So it has 3 components. 1, nature within the city. 2, the linkages between the city and its hinterland, so regional linkages. And 3, the global footprint. So this index is trying to capture the entirety of what the impacts of cities on nature, and also what nature and cities have, the relationships to. it is intended to be soft launched at the World Conservation Congress, and then fully launched at, moving up. Yeah, fully launched at COP15. And I mentioned the Singapore Index on Cities Biodiversity, also known as the CBI, or City Biodiversity Index. It's created under the leadership and guidance of Singapore. They have a user's manual for it since 2010, and they're updating it for which would be launched sometime this year or next year. It's not clear right now, but some of you here have been involved in its revision. Yeah. Okay, then moving ahead, the Urban Biodiversity Hub is also involved in all of this by being a hub, as I had mentioned before. Our role is providing value to the ecosystem of players on urban biodiversity through our online database about urban biodiversity activities in practice worldwide. It is still the most comprehensive resource of its type, with more than 1,300 locations with some kind of data point. So you can check out if what cities are doing where. And as a hub, we are able to facilitate linkages between the different players in the urban biodiversity realm to do a big picture analysis about, for example, urban biodiversity indicators and how that maps to global indicators, which is a workshop that we did at the Nature of Cities Summit back in June 2019, as you can see in the image at the bottom right. And as we work with the data that we have, we're also exploring how urban biodiversity planning is in practice, and doing research and publishing them in various forms, such as blogs, journals, white papers, and hence serving as guest experts on urban biodiversity indicators. And I have one more slide to go through about how you can find all the documents, but I can also just email that to you. And with that, I think I might have gone slightly over time, but thank you for your great attention and for all the many examples that have come up, the discussions. I see lots of things in the text or in the chat for the webinar. But at this point,
thanks, Mika.
Yeah.
Since I've been managing the chat, I can do a quick kind of summary of what's happening. So first of all, just a huge thank you to Mika for taking a very complicated thing that is in progress with lots of different voices and making it comprehensible for everyone. So I hope that everyone that was here, no matter what your starting knowledge was on this topic, that it was helpful for you. And it certainly was for me. So I just wanted to express that there were many people who were very excited about the slides and interested in how they could share the information that you shared today. So we are recording this webinar, and we also can make the slides available. We may need to go through them and see if anything needs to be removed, but for the most part, we can make a PDF of the slides and share that. With all of you via the same mailing list where we invited you to this. So that's totally doable. So you can anticipate those things being shared. Then we also there were some questions that came up in the question and answer format that I did answer on the spot. So we won't need to go through them individually, but I will bring up a couple of items that came up in the chat that were on specific topics. So the first one was from Jenny Moore, who's also here in Vancouver with me. Her question was about Target 10, which talked about access to nature. So Jenny, you can unmute yourself if you like to join this, but she was basically asking about access to nature within 400 meters as part of the context of the city's total urban boundary and sprawl. So she was wondering whether tertiary impacts were also being considered when it came to Target 10 and access to nature.
Okay, does Jenny want to give any more?
Yeah, sure, I can give some context.
To that? Yeah.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so basically, like with the eco-city model, what we try to do is peel back the pavement to allow more green space. So it totally aligned with access to nature at your doorstep. But then it does require an increased intensity in development. So you have to contract the existing footprint of cities by concentrating the development in order to create the green space. Alternatively, you can just start to create green space, but then you're pushing the city boundaries outward, which also would then potentially have an impact on agriculture, which potentially has an impact on nature. So there's a tension there around how to manage these things. And I think there's a really good planning solution for how to manage them. But I just was curious whether these kinds of realities of physical space and how to contain urban sprawl while simultaneously opening inside the city up to nature is actively being considered within this group.
Yeah, thank you for adding on to that. So interestingly, urban sprawl, as in the term, was not necessarily used that much. And I imagine, this is just me personally thinking, so do not quote me on this, that it's a touchy topic because urbanization is happening rapidly everywhere. And the negotiators at these meetings may or may not have the mandate to talk about urbanization and expansion of urban spaces and urban sprawl. But there was some concern raised whether urban biodiversity or urbanization would require a standalone target or some recognition of land use change that occurs from urbanization. And it may or may not fit into this target per se. It could be part of another target about land use change. But it's not, the governments kind of didn't talk about it at length, is what I can say. But I don't think it's missed out. I think they may not be able to actually have a concrete input on that without consulting their planning department or national development departments. But that's exactly something that we need to tackle. So that's why a lot of these, the tools and solutions section has very amorphous targets that are difficult to parse. I hope that answered your question.
Yes, thank you.
But, oh wait, sorry, just to add on to that, but it was clear that the parties understood very well biodiversity within the city space, and that they would like to have more green spaces that's accessible to their citizens in the city boundaries, but they didn't talk so much about expansion of boundaries. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, Jenny, for that. And the other comment that I wanted to highlight here was from Peggy Nguyen. And Peggy, perhaps you can unmute yourself to contribute to this discussion. She was adding to what Sabrina had said about emergency management, discussing some examples there. Peggy, did you want to elaborate there?
Sure. There are maybe 2 or 3 things that stand out in terms of examples of what we need to think about during or following emergencies. One is following wildfires. There tends to be a huge infusion of invasive plant species as a result of the disturbance, and we don't seem to have a response for that built into our emergency management systems. A second thing that happens is flooding often results in hazardous waste storage sites being disturbed, and the waste gets out into the water. So that's a pollution hazard that we need to address, and I know the United States is looking into that. And then a third is if we have a major disaster such as an earthquake and buildings come down, and there's a situation where you have an opportunity to rebuild or change your land use to open space, I think that it would be a good idea to have a plan for not just increasing green space, but restoring hydrology in a way that you have functional ecosystems, and then kind of reorganizing the land uses that were displaced into more dense or more efficient um, buildings and ways of providing those services.
Thank you so much. Peggy, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you. These, I was just taking notes as you were talking about it. And I can see how countries would delegate this to the local level or subnational level, but may or may, depending on the governance structure, may or may not have guidelines coming from the national level. And if there's any way for this to be incorporated into the framework, it would probably come in the part about climate change resilience or resilience in general. But at the target level, it might just be a broad term like resilience. But then when we start going into the indicators or the implementation and how this goes down into actual policies for the local level, that's where I think a lot of these examples or specific input would be very useful. But to use these as examples in the global discussions, give people, like, it grounds people in what all of this is.
Right. They're very concrete.
This is Sabrina, and just since Peggy was kind of building on that idea, I just wanted to note that I think the hydrology piece, it's bigger than sort of these individual examples, and it's going to affect, huge swaths of all of these countries, whether it's storm damage, changes in precipitation, sea level rise. I think just noting that, like you had mentioned before, there was the goal that specifically talked about water quality, and kind of didn't talk about all of the other important things that ecosystem function can allow. And I think just trying to figure out a way to recognize all these hydrologic changes and the importance of them is really important. So much of the impact of urban growth on biodiversity has been due to flood protections and changes in dam building and channelization and all of that. But it's really, sometimes it gets kind of short shrift when people are thinking from a terrestrial standpoint, but
just
really
to add
to be throughout this.
Sabrina, just to add to that too, we have areas that flood very frequently. And at the time that things were developed, people just built into what were floodplains and areas that frequently flooded. Now, if there's an opportunity after a disaster, maybe that flooded area could become a lake and the homes could be redistributed in a different way, So that's another example of how hydrology could be planned for post-disaster.
Mika, just to kind of use Sabrina and Peggy's point to bring out the difference between nature-based solutions and ecosystem-based approaches is what Peggy was suggesting sounds to me like an ecosystem-based approach, but from a nature-based solutions point, where if you're putting forward one particular type of solution, you need to then scale that up into what Sabrina was suggesting. So for example, bringing back to the example that I used earlier, my beekeeping thing is a nature-based solution that is very focused on one solution, being bees and planting trees. So that is a nature-based solution. Now, when you're talking about what Sabrina is bringing to the fore, you're now having to scale up what I'm doing to an ecosystem-based type of thing where you're now talking from a ridge to reef kind of approach where you're trying to prevent flooding in one localized area, creating a new lake, for example. So that needs to be a point where you're now reintroducing forestry on a valley ecosystem, where you're now using trees to modulate how water moves through a hydrological space. So that which is why for me you have to actually use both, because then if you're going to then fund a nature-based solution, you could use the mechanism to fund a nature-based solution as a part of an ecosystem-based adaptation type project for a country or for a region, so that you could modify and restore ecosystems on large swaths of land, from cities to regions to multi countries, for example. I'll let everybody else.
Hello?
Okay. Thanks, Adrian. I
Yeah.
think he was just finished
Okay.
and unmuted himself. So I just sent a message in the chat, but essentially we have 8 minutes left, and I have 2 people that have questions remaining. So we'll try to get to both of those people. And I also just want to also invite everyone, if you're interested in more information like this, or webinars or connections between various organizations, to please get in touch with us at Urban Biodiversity Hub or UBHub. Our website is at ubhub.org, and we also can be reached at ubhub.org@gmail.com. Or you could just respond to the invitation email that you received from either Mika or myself to find out more about getting involved. So our first of 2 questions remaining is from Wendy Katagi. Wendy, you can unmute yourself. And she typed in the Q&A, excellent presentation. Are there plans to highlight examples of how cities are achieving goals of urban biodiversity and access to nature through program and plan implementation and on-the-ground pilot projects, moving the needle forward? This is a really great question, in particular for us, because it's one of the things that we're keeping our eye on and hoping to promote ourselves.
Yeah, I'll just answer the question live, or is there anything more to add from Wendy?
Oh, please go ahead. Thank you, Mika.
Yeah, thanks. So that what I've talked about all the while is sort of the policy piece, but amidst all of this, many different players are. Oh, the question kind of disappeared. Sorry, Jennifer, I think.
Oh, I'm sorry. I hit answer live and that made it disappear.
Oh no, okay. Well, in any case, basically that many different entities and including ICLEI, for example, are the ones that try to showcase what cities have been doing. And there are, what do you call it, side events or back-to-back summits alongside these meetings that often feature, say, for example, cities, examples of success cases of the pilot projects that you're talking about. And so cities that do attend could learn from each other. And of course, some subnational governments are part of the delegations that attend these meetings, so that they can actually bring all of these down to their particular constituency. So a lot of this, I imagine too, is also appropriate at, for example, the IUCN World Conservation Congress, where it's not just a policy platform, and therefore there's a lot more emphasis on showcasing best practices, what worked, learning from each other. So there are events and pavilions and summits related to urban biodiversity at the World Conservation Congress. And all of that also relates to the post-2020 as the backdrop or the theme of discussion. I hope that answered your question, Wendy.
Yes, thank you. That does. Thank you so much.
So thanks, Wendy. So the next question, we have one from Diego and then one from Mas. So Diego is asking, hi Diego. He says, do we have a general
Hi.
outlook of which countries are likely to be supportive to integrating urban approaches to the new agenda?
Ooh, I will answer this live, but then I am not sure if we have to edit this out of the recording.
No country favoritism allowed.
I mean,
Interesting.
it's just because the documents are available publicly, but they don't name the countries per se for the different suggestions that are being put out. You can tell from some of the submissions who they're from, but of course, some of these discussions are sort of closed door, so it's only for discussion's sake, really. I guess then I'll answer your question not naming any specific countries, but generally speaking, countries near Europe are very well versed in like nature-based solutions and have seen the benefits from applying ecosystem-based approaches to solve some of the urban issues. So they're strong supporters of integrating biodiversity and urban planning, and having a strong showing of a strong role for subnational and local governments.
But I would add to that a lot of this has to do with the vocabulary and how it links to actions in different places. So in Europe, nature-based solutions is a very hot topic, or is a way that it's a kind of an umbrella term that a lot of things are being put under. So that's not to say that there aren't nature-oriented or biodiversity-oriented things happening in urban locations elsewhere. I mean, there are definitely some major hubs, and certainly ICLEI is a great resource for that, and they do a lot of great work around the world, but in particular in African countries. So there's work happening all over the place in all the different regions. So that's one of the reasons why at ubhub.org we have things oriented on a map so that people can get an idea of where activities are happening and if there are actions near them or in cities that are like their city. So hopefully that will be a good resource for you. But certainly there are some countries that are leaders, and of course Singapore, having developed the Singapore Index, is one of them, but they're found all around the world.
Yeah.
But and then
just to add on to that, sorry, I actually just finish off what you have to say.
Oh, go ahead. I was going to move to the next question.
Oh, okay. I'm just going to very quickly just say, Diego, all hope is not lost in your region. It's actually mainly just a difference in the use of terms, just like what Jennifer and Adrian has said. But ultimately, I think it's having the notion of ecosystem-based approach, but applied in a very urban setting, because a lot of Europe is urban, but a lot of other countries may or may not be urban. And therefore, they just have less experience in that sense of the terms. And they might be definitely already using nature-based solutions as we speak, but not recognizing it as how it falls into the definitions.
So we're 1 minute to 8:30, which is our ending time. And so I do want to just answer this last question, which is a quick one. Mas from Los Angeles is asking about the webinar that we have tomorrow morning. So some of you have been invited to this webinar tomorrow morning, and it's focused a bit more on what our work plan as an organization is for the upcoming year, and finding opportunities to get involved primarily as a volunteer, but also if any of you are interested as representatives of institutions or as a volunteer to contribute, or if you just want to find out more specifically what we're doing. It's not a private or closed meeting, so you would be welcome to join that if you have interest. So feel free to reach out to us if you didn't already get an invitation to tomorrow morning's webinar. But it will be different in that it's more oriented towards getting people more involved and just linking up with our volunteer network. He has also asked if there will be a webinar on local biodiversity efforts.
that's a great idea. We don't have one planned now, but yeah, maybe we
I'll
should
note
do
that down.
So thanks for that. So we're at 8:31. I don't want to keep you all too much longer. If anyone has some pressing questions, we're happy to sit afterwards to answer that. But in the meantime, we can go ahead and say goodbye to everyone. And thank you so much to Mika and to all of you for waking up at whatever time it is in your current time zone.
For staying awake.
To listen to us for an hour and a half.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
It was excellent.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you.
Take care.